All right, this is chapter 18 for Bio 103, and we're going to talk about urbanization and urban sprawl. We'll talk about some planning and land use strategies, talk about some transportation issues, some smart growth, and some impacts and advantages of urban areas. Now, our central case study is Portland, Oregon, which is often held up as a gold standard for urban management and controlling sprawl. Portland is in the state of Oregon, and Oregon has a law that requires urban areas to create what are known as urban growth boundaries, which separate the urban from the rural areas. This has been known to be a way in which they can manage the growth of the city. UGBs, as they're known for short, are often promoted as a way of having a good quality of life for cities. The critics call it elitist, and that it restricts the way in which land should be developed and restricts individuals and their ability to make use of land as they would want. But it does allow some development while reserving some rural areas to protect farms and forests. Urbanization is the movement of people from rural to urban areas. This has been a big change. We've been seeing more and more people moving into the cities from the countryside. The world is becoming far more urban than it ever has been in any time in history. We are moving more and more away from being an agricultural-based society on the global scale, and more people are moving to the cities, both in developed areas and in developing nations as well. So there is definitely a need for safe, clean, and healthy urban environments. Industrialization is one of the factors that has driven urbanization. With industrialization, there was less need for farmers. Once we had tractors and other mechanizations, we could cultivate as much land using fewer workers as ever before. So people left the farms. They've moved towards more urban areas, more towards cities and towns, looking for work there. Urban populations have been rising steadily throughout the world and expected to rise by 59% by the year 2050. In developed nations, urbanization has somewhat slowed. People are moving out of the center part of the city, the urban core, the actual city itself, and towards the suburbs, which are smaller communities that ring the cities. So it's increasingly becoming popular in developed countries for people to move out of the downtown and into the suburbs. Developing nations are urbanizing rapidly as people move to the cities looking for jobs or to escape from ecological damage. There are a number of factors that influence urbanization. As with many cities and real estate, the maxim is always location, location, location. Climate, topography, and waterways have been big influences in whether a city succeeds. Waters have often been a useful way to do transportation. So many well-located cities have become linchpins in trading networks as they move resources from one region to another, particularly funneling agricultural resources towards the cities where they can be made into consumer products and then utilized by the residents. Cities can thrive in resource-poor areas. This could be through the advantage of having cheap fossil fuels, water being brought in from distant areas. This is one of the reasons why cities like Las Vegas are able to thrive in the middle of the desert. Vegas is a city that has only one industry, really, and they have no real source of drinking water at the city itself. But because they've been able to import water from other parts of the state, they've been able to keep it sustainable. Cities in the southern and western parts of the U.S. have experienced the most growth in recent decades. Some of this has been driven by retirees who want to move to warmer weather and have more space. Fastest growing city in the United States recently has been Phoenix, Arizona, which grew by 97% between the years 1990 and 2009. By the mid-1900s, however, immigration and trade had decreased urbanization. Cities were seen as places filled with crowding, poverty, pollution, crime. So with these things, cities in the developed world, especially in the United States, became less attractive places to live, and the migration pattern towards the suburbs began. Affluent people, if you have the money, you can move out into the suburbs, especially as we build up more highways and make it easier to commute in and out of the cities. It's no longer a requirement that you live a very short distance from where you work. Average Americans now commute almost an hour one way to get to work. So the first people to move out of the cities are, of course, the affluent. And there are a number of reasons: more space, maybe some better economic opportunities, cheaper real estate, less crime, better schools. Some of the interesting trends we're seeing is, especially in Pennsylvania, is we're seeing, for example, lots of people moving out of the Baltimore area and into southern York County. So people are willing to commute an hour or more to work in Baltimore, but live in southern Pennsylvania in York County, where taxes are lower, they have cheaper real estate, less crime. So people have better opportunities there that they might not have access to in the Baltimore area. Other locations like the Poconos in Pennsylvania are becoming increasingly popular places for people who work in the New York and New Jersey area to commute to. So now people are buying cheap real estate in the Poconos, and they live there. Of course, they don't know what their houses look like in daylight because they've never seen it when the sun's up, because now they have to commute 2 hours to get to New York and work, and 2 hours back. Lancaster County is rapidly becoming part of the suburban landscape of the city of Philadelphia as people want to commute further and further longer distances to get to work, just to get away from some of the congestion in the counties that are closest to Philadelphia. So things that enable people to move to the suburbs: automobiles, more roads, cheap oil and cheap gas. These things have made it easier for people to commute, so we don't have to live, again, as close to the places where we work anymore. Businesses were able to import and export resources, goods, and waste. A lot of this explosion in suburban sprawl that began in the 50s was driven by the development of the interstate highway system. Originally, the highways were built for actually civil defense. The reason why the interstate highway system is sometimes referred to as the Eisenhower interstate highway system, the reason why the Eisenhower interchange here in Harrisburg area gets its name, is because these things were originally envisioned and built during the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s. Eisenhower was a general in World War II. He was very impressed with the Germans' ability to move troops and supplies rapidly around Germany using their Autobahn system. And so he really wanted to replicate that system of interstate highways in the United States, in case the Ruskies ever invaded the U.S., we would have the same capability to move equipment and personnel and supplies around the country more rapidly using these highways. But a byproduct of the development of these interstate highways has been that it has made commuting in and out of the cities much easier. Suburbs gave people what they wanted in terms of having homes with larger amounts of space, more cleaner neighborhoods, but natural areas have disappeared. Cars have become mandatory, where we're now prisoners of our automobiles. We need our cars to really get anywhere. The idea of just walking down to the corner grocery store to pick up a quart of milk is becoming non-existent in most parts of the United States, because there is no corner grocery store within walking distance of most people's homes today. We have to drive to do all of our shopping now. This has resulted in more traffic jams And cities and towns are starting to merge and kind of blur, where it's becoming harder and harder to see where one ends and the other begins. And, just drive around the Harrisburg area and you can see this. I mean, if it weren't for the signs, would you know when you left Harrisburg and entered parts of Susquehanna Township or Paxton or Pembroke or Swatara Township or any of the other communities that border on the city? It's really become just one big sprawling system. So this sprawl, which is defined as the spread of low-density urban or suburban development outward from an urban center. And we see sprawl not only from the major cities like Philadelphia and New York, but also small cities like Harrisburg. We're just seeing more and more sprawl, and the result of it is the disappearance of farmland in the region, as well as other undeveloped spaces. So the result then of sprawl is each person takes up more space than they would if they were living in a more densely populated city. So the physical spread, the footprint that a urban area occupies, starts exceeding the actual population growth. So if you can see from these satellite photos here between 1986 and 2013, the population in developed areas in Las Vegas both tripled. There's just a tremendous amount of growth here. You can see regions like up around here, which in 1986 were almost completely uninhabited, and now they're very densely populated here. You can see some of the things out in this area, comparing them between 86 and 2013. All these regions here that were almost completely uninhabited have now become filled with much more densely populated regions. So there are two major components of sprawl. One is population growth, just the size of the population, and the other is the per capita land consumption. More people want more space, more privacy. We all want the nice big lawn with the 2-car garage and everything. And this has been driven, again, better highways, cheap gas, telecommunication, where, again, it's become less critical that you live within walking distance for a lot of the services you used to use. Sprawl is often promoted by economists, politicians, and city boosters who think any development is always good. So some concerns about sprawl. One is transportation. We become more and more prisoners of our cars, and we get pressure to own cars, drive greater distances. Again, the idea of walking to the corner grocery store disappears. This makes us increasingly dependent on a non-renewable resource. This in turn can lead to pollution problems. Carbon dioxide, air pollution, smog, these things all increase and become worse with the increased vehicle traffic. Motor oil and road salt on roads and parking lots run off and become sources of groundwater contamination. Sprawl also has a big impact on health. It promotes physical inactivity because driving replaces walking, which leads to increases in obesity and high blood pressure. Land use. There are less forests, fields, farmlands available. Loss of resources. There's less land available for recreation or wildlife habitat, ecosystem services like air and water purification. Economics. Sprawl drains tax dollars away from communities. Older communities lose their tax base as people move out of those areas. They lose the money that they need to maintain roads and water and sewer systems, electricity, police, fire services, schools. Those resources all go to newer areas, often spending more per person than for these services because there's lots of duplication and more resources being stretched thin as population densities get spread out more. Urban or city planning is the designing of cities to maximize their efficiency, functionality, and beauty. In other words, it's a way of trying to design or at least modify our cities to make them more attractive. Washington, D.C. is the first planned city in the United States, the first one where they hired a designer to lay out the foundations of the city. Prior to that, all older cities kind of grew organically roads got laid out and houses and buildings got built as they were needed. In 1912, the Greater Portland Plan recommended rebuilding the harbor, new construction, and wider roads. And all of these were supposed to make the city a better place to live. So here we have some early sketches of Washington, D.C. as it was to be laid out by Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a French designer who was hired in 1791 to lay out the roadways and the basic plan and map for Washington, D.C. Plan including the diagonal avenues, the area for monuments like the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial and all those other monuments in Washington, D.C. that sprung up since then. He wanted to create a new capital city that was spacious and stately. In some ways, he also kind of designed a city that is very difficult to get around. Oftentimes, the layout of Washington, D.C. is referred to by many, and many people complain that it is too confusing and easy to get lost in this city. Regional planning is then same as city planning, but on a larger areas, often coordinating with multiple municipal governments. So you can kind of picture regional planning as it would work in central Pennsylvania, or let's just look at the Harrisburg region. Kind of what we think of as the Harrisburg area is often Dauphin, Cumberland, and Perry counties. So we have 3 counties, we have a city government, and we have several dozen townships and boroughs within those counties. And just kind of imagine trying to do a regional planning with that, and it'd be almost like herding cats, getting all of these different elected officials in the city, county, township, boroughs all together, getting them to try to agree on anything. So some areas, to address this multiple coordination thing, they've institutionalized planning into formal governmental bodies. So Portland's metro apportioned land into urban and rural reserves, so that the land could then be used in a variety of ways, and homeowners, farmers, developers, and local governments would know what future land uses will be utilized depending on the area. One important part of urban and regional planning is what's known as zoning, where you classify areas of different types of developments depending on what type of land use you want to have. So zoning involves government restrictions on private land. So opponents say it violates individual freedoms. Proponent says that this is for the good of the community. It helps them manage congestion. It helps people know what type of community they could be moving into, whether there's going to be a lot of commercial development in that area or whether it's going to be mostly residential. Urban growth boundaries, like the ones established in the Portland region, are designed to limit sprawl. They try to keep the growth in the existing urbanized areas. They try to keep the downtowns revitalized to promote redevelopment of those areas. It's also to protect the rural areas so that farms and other rural communities maintain their character. Ensures urban dwellers have some access to open space, and try to reduce some of the infrastructure costs. Critics of urban growth boundaries point out that they do increase housing prices because there's limited to where certain houses can be built. But other states and regions have adopted UGBs, including Boulder, Colorado, and a number of California areas. Even though urban growth boundaries do set some limits, unrelenting population growth can thwart even some of the best UGBs and still cause sprawling problems. A popular type of urban planning is now smart growth, which focuses on, again, revitalizing and rejuvenating the existing developed areas. They often talk about build up, not out. In other words, build taller buildings rather than wide, spacious areas with lots of lawns and spread out into the sprawling areas. So they favor multi-story shop houses and high rises, and give a strong sense of place and collaboration to the community. New urbanism is another popular idea for urban growth areas. Is to focus on redesigning and bringing the walkable neighborhoods back, bringing homes, businesses, and schools closer together so you can have functional neighborhoods where families can meet most of their needs without getting into the car. New developments have green spaces within them, some mixed architects, and some creative street layouts. So here are some recommendations for smart growth. These are considered the 10 principles for smart growth. A mix of land uses, take advantage of compact building design, create a range of housing opportunities and choices, walkable neighborhoods, distinctive, attractive communities with a strong sense of place. In other words, avoid those cookie-cutter looks of many suburban communities. Preserve some open space, farmland, and natural beauty that are critical to environmental areas. Strengthen existing communities, direct development toward them instead of out into undeveloped land. Provide a variety of transportation choices, including some mass transit. Make developmental decisions predictable, fair, and cost-effective. And finally, encourage community and stakeholder collaboration in the development decisions. Transit options that help cities. Traffic jams cause air pollution, stress, and lost time. It's estimated that the U.S. loses about $74 billion a year in lost productivity due to people just being stuck in traffic. One transportation opportunity that's being promoted in many cities today is promoting the use of bicycles. So many cities are putting more bike lanes, putting in more public bike racks to encourage the use of bicycles to get around the urban areas. Mass transit. This is any type of commuter system where people can ride in a shared vehicle, whether it's buses or subways or some other type of commuter train. Light rail is usually referred to as any type of train system powered by electricity. As you can see from these bar graphs, compared to the automobile, buses, and other types of mass transit, these three other types of rails, commuter rail, heavy rail, and light rail, all use less energy per passenger mile, and they also cost less per passenger mile than the automobile does. You see, for example, one of the costs associated with the automobile is parking. Those costs don't exist when you look at buses or any type of rail transportation. You still have some roadway costs for buses, of course, but rails don't involve those costs. So overall, mass transit is much more cost effective and energy efficient than the automobile, but the problem is often who pays for those costs. It's very difficult to make bus and rail and passenger transportation systems cost effective based on just the user fees collected. Most forms of mass transit, whether it is a busing system or a subway system, are in some way or another subsidized through taxpayers. So even though overall they cost less, the costs are often masked and often disproportionately pushed out and hidden through hidden fees and costs, whereas automobiles are paid almost entirely by the driver. So the people who own cars and park cars are much more aware of what it actually costs to run these than the average bus rider or subway rider does. The most used mass transit systems are in the larger cities, of course, such as New York subways, the T in Boston. About 25% of each city's daily commuters or travel on these systems. Portland's buses carry 66 million riders each year. It's estimated that each bus keeps 250 cars off the road each day. Most nations have extensive mass transit, where the United States lags behind, however. And one of the reasons for that is we have a much lower population density throughout most of the country. Europe is a much more urbanized and much more densely populated region than the United States is. You couple that with cheap gas. Mass transit is often have a much harder way of getting public support for it. The United States is a much less densely populated region than, say, Europe. Europe is much more urbanized, and therefore it becomes much harder to get public support behind mass transit, especially when you couple it with cheap fuel. It's just really hard to get people to support these things, especially when oftentimes they don't see an immediate benefit for themselves. Parklands are another important part of the urban life. You need someplace where you can try to escape the noise and commotion and stress of urban life. So natural lands and public parks and other open spaces that provide some greenery, some beauty, some places for recreation. They also help with some of the natural processes in urban areas. So they are often an important part of cities that are often overlooked. Even small spaces like playgrounds and community gardens can have an important benefit in increasing the quality of life in cities. Greenways along rivers, streams, or canals. Kind of think of Riverside Park in Harrisburg, which I kind of think is the world's narrowest park. It's just like that small green area that's between Front Street and the Susquehanna River, where they have like Capona and those other, regional and seasonal events that they have along the riverside. That's a city park. I know it's like really narrow and long, runs a good length of the city itself, but it is very narrow, so it's kind of a strange park. But it does have an important function in maintaining good quality of life for the city. Again, like I said, this is where Capona and a lot of these other important seasonal events occur. So American city parks arose at the end of the 19th century. They were to make dirty, crowded cities more livable. Portland's Forest Park is now the largest U.S. city park. New York's Highline Park, illustrated here, they actually took an old elevated train line that was no longer being used, and they converted into an above-ground park. Planted some green space, and they have a walkway through it, so you can have some nice greenery there in an otherwise very urbanized area. Green buildings are another thing that is becoming increasingly popular with new development. This is where you design a building using new technologies and approaches to minimize the ecological footprint. So try to build it from sustainable material, limit its energy and water use, control their pollution, and try to recycle the wastes. The Leadership Energy and Environmental Design, or LEED certification program, is a CIS program that will allow new or existing buildings can be granted what are called silver, gold, or platinum status based on how green their design is considered. Here are some examples of some green building techniques that are becoming popular in universities. These include solar collectors to heat water, photovoltaic cells to produce electricity, metal or light-colored roofs to reflect the summer sun to reduce the need for air conditioning, natural lighting systems, FCC forestry sustainable certified lumber, efficient sinks and toilets, a rain garden that collects rain runoff and uses that to grow plants. And it will also have planted roofs or green roofs, which absorb CO2. And some of these other things, low E windows providing better insulation, barrels or other systems to catch rainwater, low VOC paints and floorings, and so on. Urban sustainability is the practice of making cities more livable to make them more sustainable. So looking at a city as an ecosystem so that it uses its resources much better and creates a more positive lifestyle for the people living it. Most urban centers have both positive and negative impacts. One thing, they are resource sinks. They take in a lot of resources elsewhere from the countryside, but they also have some benefits in terms of efficiency. They allow for more efficient delivery of goods and services, allow more efficient use of electricity in schools. Water and sewer systems are more efficient because they don't have to travel as far through the pipelines. Waste disposal and collection is often more efficient as well as transportation, because people don't have to drive and travel as many long distances to get around. Because people are packed densely in cities, that means more land outside the cities is left undeveloped so that we can have more room for agriculture and wilderness and biodiversity. Cities also export waste, however, through pollution and trade. They send their garbage out to other areas to be buried or incinerated. They generate smog and other pollutants that may travel outside of their borders. As often the case, poor people often bear the brunt of the pollution because they don't have the financial means to move to cleaner areas. There's also the urban heat island effect because of the materials that go in to build cities, including pavement and blacktop. These materials absorb heat and then reflect it back out. Urban areas are much hotter than the surrounding areas. Cities, however, promote flourishing cultural life. They spark innovation and creativities. They promote education and scientific research. So they're just getting people together and exchanging ideas and coming up things, can come up with new ideas, new innovations. They become engines of technological and artistic inventiveness. Urban ecology, again, this is where we're trying to make cities more efficient by treating them more like ecosystems. So we look less in terms of their linear one-way metabolism of importing resources and exporting waste, and look in terms of being more sustainable in the long term. So ways in which cities can mimic ecosystems, including using resources more efficiently and recycling them, develop environmentally friendly technologies, account fully for the external costs the cities may generate, offer tax incentives for sustainable practices, using more locally produced resources, use their organic waste and wastewaters to fertilize the soil, and encourage urban agriculture. Baltimore and Phoenix are two cities that have been used as showcases for urban ecology. The U.S. National Science Foundation selected these two cities as research sites for its long-term ecological research program. In Baltimore, scientists found that urban and suburban watersheds have far more nitrate pollution than natural forests. Baltimore also recorded negative impacts when applying salt to icy roads in winter. The streams became 100 times saltier even in the summers. These salts killed organisms and degraded the habitat and water quality. Baltimore is now improving their water quality by upgrading its sewer system, and researchers have found that proximity to a park increases a property's values, unless crime is pervasive, in which case the property values decrease. So sustainability is happening in a variety of cities across the country, but it's a slow go because many places are already built and there's a lot of inertia in trying to get these neighborhoods revitalized and rejuvenated. But we're seeing more recycling, more urban agriculture, more mass transit in many of these areas. Plan NYC is New York City's urban ecology program to make it the first environmentally sustainable 21st century city. It's estimated that New York will have 1 million more people by the year 2030. And they're already trying to increase energy efficiency by planting more trees, improving the playgrounds, and installing bike lanes. And that brings us to the conclusion for chapter 18. So we talked about human population, how it's moved from the urban areas and then ultimately to the suburban sprawl areas. And we talked quite a bit about urban sustainability and ways to make cities better places to live.